to certain thoughts will move the cursor in certain directions. And after a while, you can simply move the cursor in any way to do, for example, crossword puzzles or to play video games. But it does take a while because the architecture of the brain is still not mapped out yet. That'll take many more decades before we have a roadmap, neuron for neuron, and can attach these things directly.
So let me ask you, if you take the kind of focused mind that you're talking about and you take away all the technology and think about what the mind can do, does that make a powerful argument for meditation?
Well, the mind is powerful if it focuses and reduces distractions, and you can increase learning capabilities, but you will have to enhance it using radio and using computers, especially if you get into very complicated things like memory. However, 2 months ago, history was made with a mouse brain. They actually were able to input a memory directly into a mouse. This is the first time in history it's been done. It's something right out of science fiction. What they did was they looked at the hippocampus of a mouse and tape recorded impulses as it learned a task. That's the gateway for memory. All memories first go through the hippocampus. They tape recorded the impulses. Then they gave it a chemical which made the mouse forget the task. Then they took this tape recording, this set of impulses, shot it back into the mouse, and the mouse immediately knew how to do the task. So this is the first time it's been demonstrated that you can actually tape record a memory and then reinsert the memory into a mouse and have the mouse perform the task that it previously forgot. Now, the implications of this are enormous because if all memories go through this hippocampus, this is also how our brain functions. And it means that memories, in principle, it hasn't been done, of course, but memories in principle might be tape recorded and then shot right back into your brain or somebody else's brain. So that somebody, for example, can learn calculus without having to study too hard.
Well, how do you record a memory? How do you
What they've done is
measure
they've
a memory? Yeah.
What they've done is, since we do not really understand the architecture of the brain, reverse engineering is still science fiction. What they've done is they've simply taken the impulses that go through this part of the brain, which is the gateway to memories. And you can simply tape record impulses as it goes through the gateway, and then later reinsert the tape recorded message. And in the coming decades, as we get better and better at it, we may actually be able to record whole sequences of memories, like vacations, for example.
If you're just joining us, my guest is Michio Kaku. He's a theoretical physicist who's a co-founder of string field theory. And his new book is called Physics of the Future, How Science Will Shape Human Destiny and Our Daily Lives by the year 2100. Now, when you were in high school, and you're kind of famous for this, you built a particle accelerator in your mother's garage. What is a particle accelerator?
Well, it's an atom smasher. The biggest one in the world is much bigger than the one I built in high school. It's 17 miles in circumference, and it creates a mini Big Bang to recreate the conditions of the early universe. What I did when I was 16 years old is I went to Westinghouse. I got 400 pounds of transformer steel, 22 miles of copper wire, and I assembled a 6 kilowatt, 2.3 million electron volt electron accelerator in the garage. When it was finished, I would plug it in. There was this huge crackling sound as I consumed 6 kilowatts of power. I blew out every circuit breaker in the house. All the lights were plunged in darkness. And my poor mom would say to herself, why couldn't I have a son who plays baseball? And for God's sake, why can't he find a nice Japanese girlfriend? What's wrong with him? Why does he build these machines in the garage? Well, I love to build machines. It got me into Harvard, so I can't complain. And that began my career as a physicist.
So you ended up, as a student, being mentored by Edward Teller, Teller being known as the father of the hydrogen bomb. He worked on the Manhattan Project, which developed the atom bomb. When you started studying with him, did you think about going into nuclear weapons development as a career?
Well, he very strongly urged me to go into nuclear weapons design. I was in high school. I was playing with antimatter. Antimatter naturally occurs from a substance called sodium 22. I put antimatter in a magnetic field and photographed the tracks of antimatter. I went to the National Science Fair and I met Edward Teller. In fact, I was on television with Edward Teller. I didn't have to explain to Edward Teller what antimatter was. He immediately knew what it was. He immediately knew what I was doing. And he offered me a scholarship to Harvard. However, he had an ulterior motive as well. Let's be very frank about this. There's a book written by a New York Times reporter called Star Warriors, and it's about a scholarship that Edward Teller was promoting. I was a recipient of that scholarship, and later it came out that the purpose of the scholarship, in part, was to create a cadre corps of young, bright scientists to propel a Star Wars program. These are young physicists just like me who fell under his wing and were shepherded into the weapons program. And when I got my bachelor's degree from Harvard, he made a pitch. He made a very big pitch. I could go to Los Alamos, I could go to Livermore, I could go to MIT and study nuclear weapons design. Unfortunately for him, I decided that I wanted to work in things that were not so destructive, but perhaps had even more power, and that is an explosion called the Big Bang, which was infinitely more powerful than a hydrogen bomb.
Now, you're Japanese and your father was born in Japan. Did the fact that atom bombs were used on the country of your father's birth affect your decision at all? I mean,
Well, my
understanding like the
parents,
destructive power of it and maybe knowing something about all the civilians who were killed?
my parents were actually born in California. However, they were sent back to Japan, which was very common for immigrant families. And they grew up in Japan. They were U.S. citizens, born in California but raised in Japan. And then they came back to California at the wrong time. They came back to California before Pearl Harbor. And when Pearl Harbor hit, there was all this hysteria. And my parents were then locked up and shipped out to a relocation camp along with 110,000 other Japanese Americans. And my parents were citizens, and yet they too were rounded up. And they spent the war years basically locked up behind barbed wire. Now, the fact that the bomb was dropped in Hiroshima had an impact in me being Japanese Americans. But I said to myself that maybe there's some good that can come out of this. Maybe science can liberate us from poverty, disease, oppression, ignorance. And I firmly believe this. I believe that science is the engine of prosperity. And I think that by creating institutions and organizations that promote knowledge and promote understanding, I think I could be part of being in a better world.
Now, among your accomplishments is that you are a co founder of string field theory. I'm going to ask you to explain what that is in the absolute simplest way possible. Simplest and briefest way possible.
Okay, well, Einstein spent the last 30 years of his life chasing after a theory of everything, an equation perhaps no more than 1 inch long that would allow him to, quote, read the mind of God. One theory which would summarize all physical law into a single expression. Well, today we think we have the theory. It's called string theory, very controversial, but we're testing the periphery of it with huge machines like the one in Geneva, Switzerland, the Large Hadron Collider. Now, what I've done is I've taken all the equations of string theory, which fill up an entire volume, a gigantic book of equations, and I've summarized it into one equation, 1 inch long. That's my equation. It's called string field theory. The language of physics is something called field theory. We have magnetic fields, gravitational fields, electric fields. That's the language of physics. But string theory was this hodgepodge of little equations and rules of thumb. And what I decided to do was create a field theory of strings. Just like we have a field theory of magnetism, a field theory of electricity, a field theory of gravity. And that's what I did. We can summarize electricity, magnetism, and gravity into equations 1 inch long. And that's the power of field theory. And so I said to myself, I will create a field theory of strings. And when I did it one day, it was incredible, realizing that on a sheet of paper, I can write down an equation which summarized almost all physical knowledge. That was power, the power of mathematics.
If I asked you what the theory is, would I understand your answer?
Well, very simply, that all the subatomic particles, neutrons, protons, quarks, are nothing but musical notes on a tiny rubber band. That when you twang the rubber band, it changes from one frequency to another. So So it changes from an electron to a neutrino. And you twang it enough, it can turn into all the subatomic particles we see in the world. So all the subatomic particles that make up our body are nothing but different notes on many, many, many tiny little violin strings, little rubber bands. And that physics is nothing but the laws of harmony of these vibrating strings. Chemistry is nothing but the melodies you can play on these vibrating strings. The